I'm author Sarah A. Chrisman.
And I'm Gabriel Chrisman.
And today we are discussing Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He wrote a lot of these.
He did. This is the classic of classics when it comes to the Victorian era, as far as I'm concerned.
There were a few of those, but yeah, this is definitely part of the Victorian canon. Absolutely.
Yes, especially for anyone researching it now.
Well, one thing that drew me into these books as a child, and I've read all of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories.
Most of them a few times.
Most of them many times over. But when I was first introduced to these as a child, the thing that drew me in was because of the way that Holmes works. He works by analyzing details. And because of that, these are a really good window into insights in the Victorian world, because
Yes.
Holmes is telling you what is abnormal about every little detail and what it should be like. And that is a really, really good way to get introduced to a world, any world.
And it's not something you found in many other novels of the time.
Right, right. And also, even later on, I noticed that even writers of fantasy have to really work at explaining their world in a way that it's not just like a bunch of dictionary definitions.
Right. It's not just exposition.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. There are a few authors who are really good at that. Who wrote Destiny's Road?
That's Larry Niven.
Larry Niven is a master at that. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a master at that even earlier. But he's doing it for a real world that he lived in.
Right.
And that was what really attracted me to these books from the get-go.
Yeah. For me, one of the really influential things about these was kind of a very sort of foundational philosophy or an approach to the world, which is that this whole genre of the detective novel, but most especially, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Holmes character, these were the novels in which the world is represented as a mystery to be solved. That basically rational analysis and scientific observation can answer anything.
We have to acknowledge that Conan Doyle did take a page from Edgar Allan Poe when he started writing these, because initially, and he even called it out, that Holmes was kind of taking a page from Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Right.
But
he's
more realistic.
Yes, and he also, while he started there, he took it way further, and he was far more scientific about it. And, Poe's stuff famously involves a lot more sort of emotion and
Poe gets kind of ridiculous.
And Poe gets ridiculous.
I mean,
where these are far more believable.
Doyle, some of his stuff, it's a bit of a stretch, some of it is, but it's not as wild as Edgar Allan Poe.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
He's not going to have... He may have a snake that came from some particular... connection to India
climbs down the bell rope.
Right, but he's not going to have an orangutan.
That orangutan.
That was pretty ridiculous.
The throat-slitting, razor-wielding orangutan was just over the top.
That was ridiculous.
That was ridiculous.
That was ridiculous. But,
yes.
Poe stuff was that way more often than not.
Yeah.
Whereas Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's is realistic more often than not.
Yeah.
And I think that's really one of the distinctions.
I agree.
But this whole approach and this whole sort of view of the world was very of its time in the late 19th century. That was becoming the way that people viewed reality. That reality was sort of scientifically solvable. That anything was achievable if you brought enough, science and industrial might to bear.
That has a role in society, but I think it can get taken too far.
It can, but it was definitely the idea that we are masters of the world through these technologies.
I think there are things beyond human control, and if you get too far into the whole we're following the science thing, then you get very deep into trouble very quickly.
Right. Well, I'm not saying it's an accurate view, but I'm saying it was their view that they were adopting at the time.
It was his view.
Well,
it was the view of some of society.
The funny thing,
and it still is.
I know, but it wasn't entirely his view. As you remember, he was a famous spiritualist, and
that's true.
Basically, he was writing Holmes as this ultimate rationalist at the time that he himself was not that.
That's a good point.
And that's one of the reasons he ended up hating the character.
Yeah, and he tried to kill him off. He tried
Desperately.
really hard to kill off Sherlock Holmes.
But every time he failed because of public demand and because of his own need for money and public recognition.
I sympathize with that.
Absolutely.
I sympathize with that. The need for money is a perpetual author problem.
Yes, and it made him be even more inventive as a writer because he had to find a way to unkill his character that he had tried to so convincingly kill.
Right, which is difficult.
And that has become a trope since then with other authors doing the same thing.
Well, it became a trope of especially pulps and graphic novels.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, I mean, graphic novels, you're virtually obliged to kill off your character
regularly,
so often.
Regularly, yes.
On a regular basis.
Partly with graphic novels, it's because the origin stories became the most popular and important part.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So you have to reinvent a new origin story every time.
Correct. It's a modern mythology.
Yeah.
But Holmes was different because Holmes was this rational, scientific one.
Mm-hmm.
And that made it even more difficult to resurrect.
Yeah, it did. I always liked Watson better than Holmes himself, to be honest.
I agree. And as you know, the author obviously preferred Watson to Holmes.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that he identified more with Watson.
Mm-hmm.
Holmes is hard for people to identify with because Holmes gets pretty annoying, quite honestly.
He's pretty annoying, and he obviously is not a very human character.
No, Watson is much more human,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why I think a lot of people prefer Watson.
But that was also the genius of these books, is giving people an over-the-top sort of version of this scientific ethos, and then giving them a character they could identify with.
True.
I mean, that was a brilliant addition to the idea of the plot.
Yeah.
But I also just really like the stories, and I like the way that these were published even, in these sort of...
The Strand.
Yeah. Some very influential sort of literary magazines that weren't like over-the-top high literature, but they weren't quite pulp either.
Yeah, it's true.
These ones went right into the sort of gap between high, serious literature and pulp, which no one took seriously. These were in between, and that's something different.
Yeah, well, there used to be a lot more of those when people were reading more.
Yes, which
and
I
there
wish.
could be again.
There could be again, yes.
Yes.
We aim for that in the future.
Yes. What's your favorite of the Sherlock Holmes stories?
My favorite of these?
Yeah.
It's probably It's hard to say. I do like the one where he tries to kill off Holmes that first time with the falls.
Yeah.
That's a really good one. And he has fun with that Moriarty character, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is, because, again, it's him sort of desperately at this point fighting against a character that he created but that he fundamentally disagrees with and dislikes.
Right.
And so it's really weird to have an author in that position.
So, considering what you just said about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's desperate attempts to kill off Sherlock Holmes, do you think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, with his spiritualist tendencies, would have said that Holmes was too deep into the philosophy of following the science?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think he was.
And
I
that
think
you
he
need
did
a
believe
human
that.
element. That you need to acknowledge free will can often throw all of your scientific theories, just toss them to the winds.
Right. And there are one or two of the stories where he makes that sort of disrupt Holmes's reasoning.
Right. And actually one of those, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of those is one of my favorite stories.
Yes.
One of the ones where Holmes just gets thrown off and he ends by telling Watson, if I'm ever getting basically well, let me find that quote because it just sums it all up. If it should ever strike you that I am getting a little overconfident in my powers or giving less pains to a case than it deserves, kindly whisper Norbury in my ear, and I shall be infinitely obliged to you. So that's one where Holmes, his carefully thought out scientific theory he finds was just absolutely not the answer to the case.
Right.
And that one is one of my favorites because it's a really sweet story. Partly I like it because Holmes fails miserably. Partly I like it because it's just a really super sweet story. Mm-hmm. It's the story of... so there's this man who comes to Holmes and Watson for help, and he knows that his wife, something's going on with his wife. He's been married 3 years, and she's doing something really mysterious, and he doesn't understand what's going on. Holmes comes to the conclusion that she's being blackmailed. But what it turns out is that they don't find this out through Holmes's, scientific methods. They find this out just by following their client and just shadowing him until he works it out for himself. What had happened was this client of theirs knew he'd married a widow. And her first husband had been in Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. And that was basically all he knew about her first husband. She didn't really talk about him much. And he knew that they had had a child, but he had assumed the child was dead.
Mm-hmm.
What he didn't know, and his wife was afraid to tell him, was that her first husband was black. And so their child, who actually had lived, and she was hiding in this cottage nearby, was a child of mixed race.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't want to tell her second husband because she was afraid of his reaction.
Right.
And so Holmes and Watson, following their client to this cottage, when he finally does discover this child of his wife's by her first husband, all that Holmes and Watson basically see is this denouement of the man meeting his stepdaughter, little girl stepdaughter, who he didn't know even existed, and then his wife telling him the whole story, and his only response, she'd been so terrified to tell him, but his only response is to just scoop up the child in his arms and say, "We can talk about it better at home." And that's the whole denouement.
That's the whole ending, yeah. Right.
Holmes and Watson had nothing to do with it. They were just kind of, this hapless pair of bumblers following along, and I like that about that story.
Right.
Yeah, so...
Well, one of the other ones we have to bring up, of course, is The Adventure of the Solitary Cyclist.
Yeah. Of course, because you're a bike guy.
I'm a bike guy. And that's, again, it was part of the society, and I think it was really good that, of course, he included one of these stories.
Right.
So,
1896 is the bike boom. And
absolutely.
The Holmes stories are all in the 1890s. It's perpetually, eternally the 1890s in the Holmes stories.
No matter when they were written.
They never move on.
Right. And that is one of the wonderful things about them. I mean, the atmosphere. There's a number of... When in library school, of course, we learn a bunch of stuff for Reader's Advisory, especially about the different reasons why how they connect to fiction, especially. And one of those is setting. Yeah. And if it's the setting you mostly connect to, these are wonderful. Mm-hmm. If it's sort of following characters, these are not as good.
Right.
But if you really connect to the setting that's displayed, the atmosphere, the place, the details, these are almost without peer for representing the 1890s.
Right, absolutely. Mm-hmm. That's why I didn't like it when they made a movie set with an older Holmes, and so it's set during World War One. Is it during World War One or just after?
I think it was in the 20s.
Yeah, I think it was in the 20s.
Right.
I didn't like that one. Mm-hmm. Even though I liked the actors that they found for it.
Right, but the setting is just wrong.
Was just wrong.
Because, and that's why the various Sherlock Holmes that are done sort of mise en scène in different settings are just, they miss the point to me. They're not doing what was best about these books.
Yeah, because, I agree. For me, the thing that's best about these books is the setting. Yeah. And that's why, if we're talking Sherlock Holmes movies, I absolutely hated that really steampunk version that they did with Jude Law
and Robert Downey Jr.
Jude Law and Robert Downey Jr. I hated that one. I love Jude Law. I mean, he's one of my Hollywood heartthrob hunks. If I ever met him, turn the other way, please. I love Jude Law, and Robert Downey Jr. is a great actor. I loved his work in Chaplin. But I hate the Sherlock Holmes movie that they did because I thought it was ridiculous and stupid. Right. I thought that if the director was gonna, pay the salary of these two big Hollywood actors, he could have spent more than 2 cents on a script. Right. It was ridiculous.
And these ones also, the language is really well done. Mm-hmm. And the language, again, in terms of capturing a certain class in the 1890s
Oh yeah.
is again
Oh, yeah.
really
Absolutely.
perfect, really good
Yeah.
at just capturing a bunch of it's not the sort of like consciously lower class, though there are occasional characters who do that. It's
there
not,
are some of those.
There
Yeah,
are,
he doesn't
yeah.
ignore them.
He doesn't ignore them, but it's most of the language is this sort of, again, not sort of highfalutin literary stuff, but just the
It's
sort of
everyday speech.
everyday speech for the upper middle class,
Right.
in the 1890s.
It's very natural speech.
Right.
It's very natural.
And I really like, again, how they capture sort of a natural picture of the environment in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's because of who it was written for. It was written for these magazines.
Right.
And that's something, if your English classes in school have been too heavy into the high literature and they've put you off of historical writing because it's just too impenetrable.
Like Henry James.
I hate Henry James.
Don't we all?
I hate Henry James. Then you should find some of the works that were published in magazines and read some of those, because it's much more approachable language. It really is.
Right.
And much more enjoyable.
And it gives you a better picture of that time, because, believe me, they didn't all speak like in Henry James.
Nobody speaks like in Henry James. Nobody speaks that way.
For whatever reason, I always picture Henry James speaking like that, though.
He probably did, and that's why nobody invited him to supper parties. I wouldn't want that guy, within 10 yards of my house.
Yes.
And another one of the Sherlock Holmes stories I really liked, I know it's a cliche, but I'm soft on The Hound of the Baskervilles.
It is an absolute classic. There's a reason that one was one of the most iconic. And it's also, I love it because it does present what could be an Edgar Allan Poe supernatural Gothic type story, and then it debunks the whole thing with science. And that is part of why it became so iconic, is because that is one of the biggest things that this whole genre was doing, the detective story, and especially Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, despite his own philosophies that he held himself. The character that he wrote was instrumental in sort of disassembling that view of the world.
Well, I think that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's spiritualist interests do come into play in The Hound of the Baskervilles, because remember that the glow-in-the-dark paint, which had come in the late 19th century.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
The spiritualists made use of that in all of their seances. They made extensive use of the glow-in-the-dark paint that was available in the late 19th century. And in Hound of the Baskervilles, someone actually puts it on the dog that he has set to...
And I'm sure that Arthur Conan Doyle had direct experience with that among the less reputable spiritualists that he had contact with.
I'm sure he did. I'm sure he had seen it for himself, and it got him thinking about, this could be a really fun plot device.
Right, exactly, yeah.
And so, little details like that. And some of these, if you read these closely, and you've also studied enough Victorian history, you can see the things that are hiding in plain view to a certain extent, because a lot of people, when they hear about, glow-in-the-dark paint, they assume glow-in-the-dark paint is such a modern thing. But you read Hound of the Baskervilles, and he's using it on this dog in the 1890s. As a plot device.
Right.
And it's right there. And then in that story I was talking about that I like so much, The Yellow Face, which that story, the title comes from the fact the little girl always wears this mask. She's playing around with this mask. And the husband, who's their client, has given... his wife has given her all her money from her previous marriage, and told him to take care of it for her. And he'd done this against her protest. It says... There's one thing I ought to tell you before I go further. When we married, my wife made over all her property to me, rather against my will, for I saw how awkward it would be if my business affairs went wrong. Now, the fact that he says, rather against my will, goes directly against a lot of the stereotyped things the feminists would have us say about how, the men stole all the women's money right when they got married, because this is a case where he's calling it out directly, where the woman had control of her own money and she wanted her husband to take care of it for her, and he didn't want to.
It's also a way of telegraphing what type of man he is to make the ending make a lot of sense.
Yeah, it is.
Right.
It is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a bit of foreshadowing there.
Yeah, correct.
And so, again, these books are really good insights into the culture and the history of the time. Even though they are kind of lowbrow in some ways.
Kind of, but again, they're not pulps. They're better than that.
Not fully pulps.
Right, yeah.
But yeah. Anyhow, they're really good books.
Mm-hmm.
And they are part of our cultural canon. I think everyone should read them. I don't know, do you think everyone needs to read all of them? Some of them do get a little repetitive.
If you're interested in the late 19th century, I highly recommend reading all of them.
Yeah, well, I as I said, I've read all of them multiple times.
Me too.
Definitely everyone should read a substantial number of them.
Yeah.
And if you like them, go ahead and,
read them all.
Read them all.
There aren't any terrible stories in among them.
No, it's just that some of them get a little repetitive.
Sure, they get repetitive.
But I mean, when you've written that many with the same characters...
That was part of the reason he did try to kill him off. He was tired of him, too.
Yes, exactly.
And he was running out of ideas.
Yeah.
But I also read them that way as a story of an author struggling with a character.
Yeah.
An author struggling with a series.
Right.
An author struggling with what does succeed commercially versus what he wishes would succeed commercially.
I definitely sympathize
Exactly.
with that.
And so that makes it a fascinating series as well.
Yes. So, definitely check it out.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, remember to check out my books, too. We hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a nice thumbs up. And happy reading!